Friends, good evening and welcome to TheoEd Talks. My name is Ryan Bonfilio, and I'm the director of the Candler Foundry at Emory University, and I'll also be your host for tonight's program. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us for this TheoEd Talks event. In just a few moments, you're going to have the chance to hear from some amazing speakers, including the lead pastor of one of the fastest growing churches in the country, from the dean of the chapel at historic Spelman College, from the founding CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and from a clinical psychologist and professor at McAfee School of Theology. We are so excited to have these amazing speakers with us for what is the 6th installment of the TheoEd series. When TheoEd began back in 2017, we had the goal of creating a faith-based speaker series that could do for the Bible, theology, and spirituality what the popular TED series had done for technology, entertainment, and design. That is, make the best learning available in a format that was accessible and engaging to a broad audience. With this vision in mind, we set out to bring together leading thinkers in the church and the academy to give the talk of their lives in 20 minutes or less. By packaging powerful ideas in bite-sized talks, we hope to spark conversations that would change the way you think about God, religion, and the power of faith to shape lives and communities. And over these years, we've had the chance to hear from some amazing speakers, people like Shane Claiborne and Austin Channing Brown, Hillary McBride and Jonathan Merritt, Will Gaffney and Pete Enns, Diana Butler-Bass and Greg Ellison. These and other speakers have addressed a range of topics from racial injustice to the subversive power of gratitude, from science and faith to the Bible's language about God, from body image to poverty. Our TheoEd Talks events have been hosted here in Midtown Atlanta through a partnership between First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta, where TheoEd was born, and Emory University's Candler School of Theology. I'm excited to announce that for the first time in 2022, we're going to have the chance to take TheoEd on the road to other cities outside of Atlanta. Our first stop is going to be Charlotte, North Carolina, where through a partnership with Queen's University and First Presbyterian Church of Charlotte, we are going to offer a TheoEd event on February 27th, 2022. And it's going to feature speakers like pastor and social activist Otis Moss III, author Barbara Brown Taylor, and poet and theologian Christian Wyman. As TheoEd has grown over the years, we've had a chance to get to know you, our audience, better. You come from a wide range of church traditions, and you reflect diverse cultural and racial backgrounds. Many of you are millennials or Gen Zers who are seeking new pathways to explore your spirituality. Some of you are teachers, and some of you are students at seminary. Some of you are activists, and some of you are nonprofit leaders, and others still describe yourselves as being just curious about faith. Wherever you are on your journey, we hope that TheoEd Talks presents an opportunity for you to ask questions about God and spirituality in a way that feels fresh, compelling, and authentic to who you are. Now, this being our 6th TheoEd event, we're starting to feel pretty comfortable with how we operate things. Then again, we've never done a TheoEd event during a global pandemic. And as with most things in life these days, COVID-19 is sure throwing a monkey wrench into how we do things. For instance, this is the first TheoEd event that we are filming in an empty venue. All of you are tuning in from live stream from afar, and this has presented some difficulties for us. For instance, we're not able to offer you the mediocre coffee and stale cookies that we typically would in our pre-event reception, nor can we do the book signing and meet and greet afterward, which no doubt would be a super spreader activity if there ever was one. But the hardest adjustment that comes with COVID-19 is the one that our speakers have to make. It's hard enough to have to give the talk of your life in 20 minutes or less, and then to have to do it in front of a bunch of empty seats. Well, that's even harder. So we wanted to help out. Inspired by the NBA and the NFL, we decided to create those cardboard cutout fans that go in all of the empty seats. You probably have seen these if you watched the Super Bowl a couple weeks ago. There were 30,000 cutout fans in that stadium, all of whom weren't able to block any better than the Chiefs' offensive line. But that's another story. 30,000 cutouts, that's a lot of cardboard, and it's a lot of money. And I looked at our budget, and we saw that we had enough money to make 3 cardboard cutouts for our audience. Now, only having 3 cardboard cutouts, it raised a difficult decision about who to choose, whose image to put on our cardboard cutouts. Now, one natural suggestion would have been Jesus, right? In educational circles in the church, Jesus is always the right answer. Like if you're in Sunday school and someone says, "What is gray and has a bushy tail and lives in a tree and eats nuts?" The answer is Jesus, even though that sounds a heck of a lot like a squirrel. But when it comes to cardboard cutouts of the Messiah, me and my team had some reservations. After all, there's that second commandment thing about not making graven images of God. So we scrapped that. Our second idea was, what if we used images of great figures in church history? What if we had a Martin Luther or a John Calvin, a Howard Thurman or a Martin Luther King Jr.? And that sounded great in some ways, but then we feared that that might intimidate our speakers to have all of those great figures in the audience. It would be like in an NBA game, all of the cardboard cutouts would be Michael Jordan and Wilt Chamberlain. We didn't think that was a great idea. So we went back to the drawing board, and after much deliberation, we came up with these 3 characters. The first is Yoda, the famous Star Wars figure from the planet Dagobah. Now, don't get me wrong, it would be incredible to have a wise Jedi master here with us at TheoEd Talks, but if we're being honest, Yoda is only here because the much younger and far more adorable Baby Yoda was not available. Our second character is only slightly younger than Yoda. It's Bernie Sanders, the irascible senator from Vermont. Here you see Bernie in his iconic pose from the recent inauguration event. And if you've been paying attention to social media, you'll know that this image has sparked countless Photoshop memes in recent weeks. My favorite is Bernie seated just like that next to the disciples in Da Vinci's a famous picture of the Last Supper. Check it out, it's hilarious. Third and finally, we have this llama. Now, why a llama? Well, who doesn't like a llama? Llamas are fuzzy, they always look like they're smiling, they often make their way into Super Bowl commercials, they just seem like the great TheoEd character. If you're curious, my staff has affectionately named this particular llama Theodora Edwards. It's both sophisticated and on brand. I love it. Now, I want to turn things over to our first speaker, but before I do so, 2 very brief programming notes. First, we will have 4 talks tonight, and after the second talk, we will pause for a very brief 10-minute intermission. And normally at a TheoEd event, we bring all the speakers back up on stage afterwards for a roundtable Q&A, but unfortunately, due to COVID, we are not going to do that this time. But if you are following us through our live stream or the TheoEd Facebook page, you are welcome to post comments and questions to those sites. So, without further ado, let's turn to our program. Our first speaker this evening is the lead pastor of Impact Church, a multicultural gathering here in Atlanta that has been named one of the fastest growing congregations in the United Methodist Church. He is a graduate of the Interdenominational Theological Center and is the author of numerous books, including Leadership Directions from Moses, On the Way to a Promised Land. His talk tonight is titled, Embracing Uncertainty. Please join me in welcoming to the TheoEd stage, Reverend Olu Brown.
When I was younger, a sage in my community said, "Olu, there is no telling where life will take you." He was right. Over the years, life has taken me to places I never imagined. But you know, this wise sage did not tell me that life would be filled with uncertainties. Perhaps this was because he didn't quite know that there would be this pandemic called COVID-19. He left out that part of the story. You know, life at its best is really filled with uncertainties. The life that we're living now in the midst of a pandemic is filled with numerous uncertainties every single day. I like a good working definition of uncertainty. It is the inability to know and to control next. I mean, that is the exact opposite of human nature. We want to control everything. We want to know everything. We want to manage everything. We want to have our hands on everything. There's this retail company that I support quite often that helps me with my own uncertainty. Every once in a while, they'll send me an email and say, hey, Olu, I know that you're uncertain about what to purchase next. And we have this great algorithm that will help you based upon your previous shopping history. We think you would buy this item. They try to help me manage my uncertainty. But even with all of the wonderful algorithms that exist in modern day science, there is still no way that we can know and manage next. That's what uncertainty is all about. It was a year ago that the whole world shifted. Do you remember when COVID-19 became a pandemic and uncertainty became the new normal? As leaders in our local church, we had 48 hours to pivot from being a dual platform worshiping church, meaning in person and virtual, to becoming a 100% single platform virtual worshiping community. We only had 48 hours. It was the same shift that the healthcare community had to make. It was the same shift that the business community had to make. It was the same shift that the political community and government and throughout the world, everyone had to shift in a moment's notice. And so I am grateful that our team shifted. But guess what? Just a few weeks after we made that shift, there's this big Sunday in the Christian world called Easter Sunday that was coming up. And we were filled with uncertainty because that first week was okay, but then the chatter around the world began, will we have a virtual Easter experience? And we realized the answer was yes. And now, a year later, as Easter comes around again, chances are we'll be hosting another virtual 100% Easter experience. Uncertainty is the new normal. Here's a question for you. How do you respond to uncertainty? Now, there are several ways that most people respond to uncertainty. Some people ignore uncertainty and they tell themselves, look, if I can just overfunction in another area of my life and underfunction in the areas of uncertainty, that things will get better and it will be okay. There's another way to respond to uncertainty, and that is to deny uncertainty. That's where you convince yourself and all of the people you're in relationship with that uncertainty is not real, that everything is certain, and that if we would just change our thinking and deny it all, it will get better. But there's another way that some people respond to uncertainty, and that is simply to wait it out. You go and you get a calendar and you put it on your wall, and every day you check a day and you check a week and you check a month, and eventually you get to a year, and that strategy is, I will just wait out uncertainty. Do you deny uncertainty? Do you ignore uncertainty? Or do you wait out uncertainty? But allow me to give you a fourth option. Now, before I give you this option, I want to let you know it's going to take courage to accept and choose this option because it's not easy. Here it is. What if you embraced uncertainty? What does it mean to embrace uncertainty? It means that you take off your superhero and your superhero capes and you surrender to the frailty of humanity, and you publicly or privately admit to yourself and other people you have no idea and no control over the next second, the next minute, the next hour, the next day, or even the next year. And I know this is not easy because some of us are paid to be certain. I mean, your job description is filled with texts of certainty. You are the person in the family who always has the answer. And so for you to choose this option to embrace uncertainty means that you have to walk into spaces that is used to you knowing all of the answers and publicly declare, I'm really not sure about next. See, that's what it means when we are able to fully embrace uncertainty. Jesus talks about this in Luke's gospel. He says, have you ever added a single day to your life through fear or anxiety or by worrying about things that you can't control? The answer is no. The healthcare community has taught us that the power of stress and anxiety on the human body literally subtracts days and weeks and years from our life. The professor Brene Brown at University of Houston talks a lot about embracing uncertainty in these wilderness moments. She says, what would happen if you remain curious in the midst of uncertainty? Why? Because through curiosity, you discover new awarenesses about yourself. You discover new awarenesses about the people you're in relationship with. And guess what? You also discover new awarenesses about the world. What happens when we surrender and embrace uncertainty? What happens when we follow the wisdom of Jesus and stop being anxious over things that we can't control? What happens when we do like Brene Brown in the midst of the wilderness of uncertainty? We stay curious. But let me offer another suggestion of how you can embrace uncertainty. And it's through what I call eternal truths. These eternal truths in the midst of uncertainty are the most certain things that you can stand on. Here's that first eternal truth. It is that in our world, there is more good than there is evil. Now, if you follow social media and you follow any other type of news media, and you have these conversations with yourself and conversations with each other, and you look at what's happening close to you and around you, chances are you might think from time to time that there is more evil in the world than good. But you're wrong. The eternal truth is this. In spite of the uncertainty of the world that is around us, there is more good than there is evil. The year was 1998, and I was in college, and I was on that transition from my teen years into my early 20s. And there were two horrific murders that happened in the United States of America in 1998. One in Wyoming and the other in Texas. A young man by the name of Matthew Shepard, who was also a college student, just a year older than I was, 21 years old, was beaten, was murdered and tortured, and left in the brutal, cold Wyoming night air to die. He was killed because he was gay. In Texas of that same year was a gentleman by the name of James Byrd Jr., who lived in Jasper, Texas. I know a little bit about Texas because I was born in Texas. That part of Texas we call the Piney Woods of East Texas. I was born in a small town called Lufkin, and about 50 miles from Lufkin was Jasper, Texas, where James Byrd Jr. lived, and he died. As a matter of fact, during the summer in college, I worked for a company whose corporate offices were in Jasper, Texas. The story is told that James Byrd Jr. was picked up by 3 white supremacists who beat him, who stripped him of his clothing and chained his body to the back of a truck and drove away, and he was decapitated. Why was he murdered and killed? It was because he was black. Some years later, when President Barack Obama had his first term in office, in those first few weeks and months in the White House, he signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And I learned something as a 20-something-year-old, as I was dealing with the uncertainty of good and evil, that in that moment I had to land on the eternal truth that there is really more goodness in the world than evil. I realized that those 2 individuals that took Matthew's life in Wyoming did not represent people in Wyoming or the state of Wyoming. I grew up in Texas. I'm a Texan. I knew those 3 white supremacists who killed James Byrd Jr. did not represent me and my family and our community or the community of Jasper, Texas. And so as a 20-something-year-old dealing with uncertainty and embracing it, I fell to the eternal truth that even in the midst of evil and evil acts in the world, there is still more goodness and more good people than there are those who practice evil and do evil acts. But what is that second eternal truth that can help you manage as you are embracing uncertainty? Here it is. Love conquers all. See, wherever there is goodness, you can always be assured that it is based in the foundation of love. And guess what? Love really does conquer everything. In the Greek New Testament, there are these 3 different words that are used to describe love. There's eros, which is romantic love. There is philos, which is the family and friendship love. And then there is agape, which is God's unconditional love. We meet this love in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, these poetic verses, in that final verse, Paul says, now faith, hope, and love abide, and the greatest of these is agape, God's unconditional love. May I make my own confession about embracing uncertainty? So often I have been guilty of blaming the uncertainty of the world and focusing on the uncertainty of the world and the uncertainty of other people only, and not focusing internally on my own uncertainty. And realizing that whenever I address my own uncertainty with the unconditional love of God, then I meet patience. Then I meet kindness. Then I meet forgiveness. Then I'm able to give second and third and fourth and fifth chances to the people I'm in relationship with, but most importantly, to myself. See, I realize whenever I can manage my own uncertainty by embracing it with the love of God, then I am better able to manage and embrace the uncertainty of the world that I live in. See, there is this eternal truth that there is more good than evil. There's this eternal truth that love conquers all. But then there's this final eternal truth. Here it is. There is a future filled with hope. Of all of the words that I say most often, this word hope is the one that I say more times than I'm willing to admit. Hope, hope, hope. What is hope? Hope is this undying belief that things will get better. But sometimes people lose their hope. And I think there is no greater despair in life than to live life without hope. James Weldon Johnson, who penned the words of what we now call the Negro National Anthem, hidden between those stanzas, he says, in the days when hope unborn had died, hope was supposed to make it, but it didn't show up. Hope RSVP'd for the party, but it came too late. There was a promise of hope, but the promise was broken. I know that there are people watching around the world who have lost hope, but we must be reminded in the midst of uncertainty that there is a promise of a future filled with hope. I am the product of slave ancestors, and these ancestors had a deep and abiding theology. They practice what we call eschatological hope. But let's look at that first word, eschatology. It is the study of the end of times, the end of things. Now, if you just think about eschatology as this isolated study, it sounds a little bit depressing. But if you merge that with hope, it becomes something entirely different. What is eschatological hope? It is a belief that in spite of how difficult today is, if you would dare to wake up tomorrow, chances are things will be a little bit better. My slave ancestors would intertwine this eschatological hope theology in the music and the words that they sang. And Negro spirituals like, "Go down, Moses, way down, in Egypt land, tell, O Pharaoh, to let my people go. What they were essentially saying is that although they were in bondage, they believed in the power of prayer, that although they would die in bondage, God would answer their prayers and the next generation would live in freedom. Still, even today, in more recent times, African Americans have found a way to intertwine this theology of hope in music and song and lyrics. That great songwriter, singer, business person, philanthropist, social activist, Sam Cooke said, "I was born by a river in a little old tent. And just like that river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming. Hear the hope. But I know that a change is going to come soon." How do we take this theology of hope and use it in the midst of a pandemic that is filled with uncertainty? We believe deep within, as we embrace uncertainty, that our current reality will not be always. There's going to come a day when there is no longer a pandemic. There will come a day when the gap between those who have and those who have not won't be as great as it is right now. There's going to come a day when, regardless of the zip code where a child is born, they'll have a quality education. There won't be food deserts, but there will be quality food. And guess what? Healthcare will be provided to all. There's going to come a day where these isms that keep us incarcerated and don't allow freedom and justice to be available for all people will go away. And in spite of your sexual orientation, your nationality, your religion, your disability, your age, your gender, we will all be seen as God's people and as God's children. Why? Because we have the hope of our ancestors that says, even in the midst of a difficult moment, if we would dare to keep the faith, tomorrow will be better. So what do we do with uncertainty? You have a choice. You can ignore it. You can deny it. You can wait it out. Or you can be courageous and you can fully embrace it and stop trying to be a superhero or a super shiro and surrender to the frailty of the human experience. Remember, Jesus said, you can worry all you want about things you can't control, but it won't help. And as Brene Brown says, in the midst of your wilderness, open your eyes and stay curious and see what God is trying to show you and to tell you. And then hold fast to these eternal truths that I had to learn the hard way in my own life, that there really is more good than there is evil, and love truly does conquer all. And as my slave ancestors remind me to this very day, that if you dare to wake up tomorrow in the midst of believing in hope, chances are it'll be a little bit better. The choice is yours. But for some reason, I think you're going to choose to embrace uncertainty. God bless you, and I'll see you in your hope-filled future.
Well, Reverend Olu Brown, thank you so much for starting us off this way. An incredible talk, an incredible challenge for us to embrace this uncertain moment that we find ourselves in the world today. Our second speaker tonight is the Dean of the Chapel and the Director of the Wisdom Center at Spelman College. She is also the founder of an organization called She Preaches, a ministry that helps support African American millennial women in ministry. She holds degrees from Clark Atlanta University, Yale Divinity School, and Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Her talk tonight is titled, What It Means to Be Human. Please join me in welcoming to the TheoEd stage Reverend Dr. Nichelle Guidry.
I want to preface these thoughts tonight by admitting that I am a little embarrassed that it has taken me 36 years to learn the lessons that I'm about to share with you, as if the ups and the downs and the ins and the outs of my life had not been trying to impress these upon me every single day. I will also preface these thoughts by saying that better late than never is a real thing. And that I am so grateful that in the year of our Lord 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic and a long overdue racial reckoning, that God allowed me to begin to learn these lessons and to embrace them for my life. That being said, I stand before you this evening to share some thoughts on what it means to me to be human. But before I get to those lessons, let me contextualize, share the story of how I stumbled into these understandings. It was a Thursday morning in November 2020. I got up super early that morning before the sunrise so that I could mentally and spiritually prepare for my annual review with my boss and my boss's boss. Soon after I woke up and got out of bed, I realized quickly that, in the words of my ancestors, my body was racked with pain. So I got up, went to the kitchen, went to the medicine cabinet, and I got some medicine to help to alleviate the discomfort. And I remember the exact moment that I began to feel drowsy from that medication. I remember the exact moment that I decided to forego pulling a shot of espresso because I didn't have the espresso and the medicine doing too much inside of my body. And I remember the exact moment that I sat down on the couch, said to myself, let me just sit here while this medicine takes effect, and fully intending to wake up in time for my annual review. But it was some hours later that I finally woke up. Sun had fully risen in the sky, and I had long missed my annual review with my boss and my boss's boss. I felt myself immediately come down with a case of panic. I opened my email and I found an email from my boss expressing his concern, and when I called him to explain the events of the morning, I was overwhelmed by his compassion and his grace for the situation. Yet and still, there was something on the inside that would make me live it down. There was something on the inside that could not let it go. There was something on the inside of me that felt like such a failure. And I continued to feel that way until the next week when I finally made it to my therapy session. And in therapy, I continued to weep and I continued to bemoan my failure, what I felt was a deep sense of failure. And I caught, again, another glimpse of grace in my therapist's eyes right before he said to me, "Who said that you weren't allowed to make mistakes? You're human, Nichelle." And ever since that moment, I have been meditating, I have been praying, I've been thinking, I've been journaling about what it means to me to be human. And I'll share 5 quick reflections with you. First, you will make mistakes. You will make mistakes. You will drop balls. You will disappoint yourself and others. You will forget deadlines. Book your schedule. You will say things that you wish that you did not say. You will do things that you wish that you did not do. You will make decisions that feel right in the moment, but you may live on years later to regret that very decision. You will stay in debt situations too long, and you will forget the birthdays and the anniversaries and the other special occasions in the lives of the people you love. But when this happens, try your best not to chastise yourself. You may realize immediately that I made a mistake. It may dawn on you years later that I could have done something differently then. But when it happens, try to look at your mistakes as an invitation to simply step back, to retool, and to do some things differently in your life. Try to look at them as an opportunity to just see your life from a different perspective, if but just for a moment. And most importantly, look at your mistakes as an opportunity to practice some resilience and some recovery. Yes, we all drop balls from time to time, but what's most important is that you eventually pick the ball up, you get back in the game, and you continue to move forward. Next, you have limitations. We all have limits. Sometimes we take on more than we can actually and realistically accomplish. If we're being really honest, sometimes we have the tendency to commit to do things that are beyond our physical and our emotional and our spiritual capacity. And when I've sat with my own tendency to do these things, I've had to get really honest that somewhere on the inside of me, and maybe this applies to you too, we do believe that we are what we do, that we are the sum total of the jobs that we hold and the organizations and the institutions that we represent and the boards and the committees that we sit on and the platforms that we preach on and that we speak on and how many people follow us on social media and who knows our names and this part, the awards, the recognitions and the accolades that we get for the work that we do in the world. Yes, we all hit these limits sometimes, and it just is a part of our human experience that sometimes you hit those walls of exhaustion where you cannot possibly produce or cannot possibly do anything more than you already have. We also hit that wall of annoyance where every single thing and every single person gets under our skin because it's time for us to take a step back. We're frazzled, we're burnt out, and we've got nothing left to give. We all hit these walls sometimes. In fact, Grandmaster Flash said it like this: "Don't push me, because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under, Well, you want to know how to keep from going under? You want to know how to keep yourself from being pushed beyond your limits?
I'm sorry, your mic has dropped out. So it's not your fault, it's just a technical issue. So
Okay.
here's what we're going to do. We're going to change that out real quick.
Okay.
Make sure that people at home can hear it.
Okay.
Preserve it. So
Okay.
let's just take 1 minute. I'm very, very, very sorry.
That's okay.
Help you. For those who are
Okay.
watching, we will be right back. Go, just stretch your legs a second. We'll promise this will only be a minute. Just a very quick technical glitch here.
Okay. Check, 1, 2, 1, 2, mic check.
All right, friends. Well, thank you for your patience. And Dr. Guidry, we are so sorry for this. It's hard enough to give these talks and have to be interrupted. But we are going to restart midway through Dr. Guidry's amazing talk, and we'll reconnect right there. So the stage is yours.
What it means to be human, right? This is life in practice. So number 2, again, we all have limits. Sometimes we take on more than we are able to realistically and actually accomplish. At times, we are compelled to commit beyond our physical, emotional, and mental and spiritual capacities. And as I've sat with my own tendency to do this, I realize that somewhere we all believe that we are what we do, that we are the sum total of the jobs that we hold and the institutions and the organizations that we are a part of and the boards and the committees that we sit on and the platforms that we preach and that we speak on and how many people follow us on social media and how many people know who we are and this part, the awards and the accolades and the recognitions that we get for the work that we do in the world. But it is also true of our human condition that we hit walls, that we have limits, that we will from time to time hit that wall of exhaustion where we can no longer produce or push ourselves at the same rate that we're used to. It also happens that we hit that wall of frustration and complete annoyance, such as with technology sometimes, where everything and anything just gets under your skin because you're frazzled and you're burnt out and it's time to stop and recalibrate. Yeah, we all hit these limits sometimes. In fact, Grandmaster Flash said it like this: "Don't push me 'cause I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head." It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. I keep from going under. In fact, you want to know how to keep from going under? You want to know how to keep yourself from being pushed beyond your limits? Well, the answer, the antidote, is in establishing and enforcing boundaries. Boundaries are those rules and those expectations that we set for ourselves and for others that allow us to preserve our energy and to protect our peace and to create rhythms of rest and restoration in our lives. And anytime you decide that it's time for me to establish and to enforce some boundaries, you are bound to get a range of reactions. Some people will respect your boundaries while others reject them. There may even be those who say to themselves, "Who is she? Who is he? Who are they to actually have a boundary?" And in that moment, it is not incumbent upon you to explain or to defend your boundaries. It is only your job to enforce them anyway. Number 3, you will need help sometimes. I believe that everything that we are called to is a divine mission, a divine assignment. Every job we hold, the vocation that we live into, the communities that we are a part of, the relationships and the partnerships that we are in, all of them are a divine assignment from God that happen, that exist for a divine reason, purpose, and mission. And isn't it just like God to call us to do things and to call us to assignments that are bigger than we can ever accomplish on our own? Think Moses and Aaron, Ruth and Naomi, Jesus and the 12, and now all of us and the Holy Spirit. And in addition to the help of God, you will need capable hands to help you with your work. You will need loving hearts to help you weather the storms that you face in your life. You will need partners in laughter and dancing and frolicking when the joy and the goodness of God are too much for you to hold on to yourself. In fact, as a trained and a practicing womanist, I could call the role of the Black women in my life who have saved me over and over again. I've publicly spoken and written about how sisterhood saves. It has been in my life Black women who have spoken my name in rooms and at tables that I could never walk into on my own. They read the pages of my dissertation before I defended it. They listened to my talks and my sermons and my lectures hours before I stood to deliver them. They walked me through the valley of depression and divorce and stood with me on the mountaintop of recovery and even the mountaintop of being called to Spelman College as the dean of the chapel. In the words of the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilks, if it wasn't for the women, I would have never learned that needing help and asking for help and receiving help doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you limited. It doesn't mean that you're any less awesome or amazing or anointed than you really are. In fact, having help and knowing that you've got some people that unequivocally have your back actually enables you to reach farther and dig deeper and make a more indelible impact in the world. There's an African proverb that says that if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And it's in the togetherness that we multiply our strength, that we multiply our resources, and we multiply our impact. Number 4, rest is a non-negotiable. As I think back to that morning that I missed my annual review, I have to be honest and I have to admit that I overslept partially because of the medication, but more importantly because I was exhausted. I was up the night before until about 8:30 on Zoom with some students, and I didn't make it to bed until much later. And as I've processed these events, I remembered the words of my mother, who when I was in college told me very succinctly that if you don't give your body what it needs, your body will take what it needs. Yes, these bodies of ours are brilliant and they have a mind of their own. And if we do not give our bodies the rest and the nourishment that they need, our bodies have a way of laying us down. And now I want to say a special word to my people, to Black people in the United States and throughout the diaspora. We are the posterity of a people who never had the luxury of being able to rest when they were weary. And every single day they reckoned with an abject sort of evil that reduced them from humans to machines. Tricia Hersey, the bishop of the NAP ministry, famously writes that rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts white supremacy and capitalism. Yes, we have these amazing, strong wills and seemingly unbreakable work ethics inside of our DNA. But, oh, my people, we are most worthy of the rest and the restoration that God promises us, particularly in Psalm 23, where the psalmist paints a picture of what restoration can look like. And I wonder today, what would it mean for us to actually follow God as God leads us beside still waters? What would it look like for us to actually do the things that restore our souls for God's name's sake? And what would it feel like if we actually lied down in those green pastures and took us some really good naps? What would it look like? What would it feel like? What kind of world could we create if we moved through the world and we ministered to the world from a place of restfulness rather than a place of weariness? What would it mean for us to give to our communities out of our overflow and not just out of the leftovers? Rest is a non-negotiable. Finally, take it easy on yourself. Now here, I want to take us back to the beginning. Not to that Thursday where I dropped the ball on my annual review, but on the following Wednesday when I was sitting in therapy. I will literally never forget the words that my therapist spoke to me when he said, "Who told you that you weren't allowed to make mistakes? You're human, Nichelle." And then he said, "Take it easy on yourself, Doc." And isn't it just like us? Isn't it often our default that when we make mistakes or when we feel as if we failed, that, oh, cue the self-deprecating scripts that we play over and over again. Cue the broken records that we play over and over again about what a failure we are and how we're not good at our jobs, and the sweeping character judgments and personality assessments that we make after making one simple mistake. Oh, what would it look like if when we needed it the most, we extended to ourselves the grace, the love, and the compassion that we really need? What would it feel like to us to extend to ourselves the same grace that God gives us every single day, and certainly the same grace that we are so quick to give to everybody else except for ourselves? I don't know what it'll look like for you, but I've been practicing crying it out and praying it out and even shouting it out and writing it out in my journal. Maybe for you, it looks like taking that long, hot bath, or indulging in that sweet, super rich dessert, or slowly brewing, slowly pouring that cup of specialty coffee from your favorite origin, and doing all of these things when you feel that you are least deserving of them. When we are kind to ourselves, when we are easy on ourselves, we create room for God to move in our lives. And we also create space for grace and growth to show up. Speaking of grace, let me wrap this up. Yes, we have these limitations. Yes, we have these challenges that all come part and parcel with what it means to be human. But to be human also means that we are gifted, that we are endowed, that God bestows upon us a special ability to be able to perceive when the miraculous is happening right before our eyes. The miraculous is what happens when God looks at God's children and sees, my children have done everything that's in their power to do. The miraculous is what happens when the work gets done despite the exhaustion. The miraculous is what happens when you're worried about having enough, but the provision of God makes there be enough, more than enough, to go around. The miraculous is what happens when one door closes and another one really opens. The miraculous is what happens when ways are made where we could not previously even imagine, how is this going to get done? A way out of no way. If we were back in my home church, my youth pastor used to say it like this: it's what happens when our natural meets up with God's super and the supernatural occurs. The supernatural occurs daily because we are in a constant dance with all of creation. And this is not a dance that requires that we push, that we force, and most certainly that we break anything. This is a dance that simply requires us to show up and shake something, show up and move something, show up and do what we can do and give what we've got, and step back and perceive when the miraculous, when the glory of God is revealed to us, in us, through us, and around us, even with these human eyes. Thank you.
Well, Reverend Dr. Guidry, thank you so much for the gift of that talk, of what it means to be human. I don't know if you're like me, but both of those first two talks seem to speak directly to what I'm experiencing, direct to where we all are in the world these days. Friends, the really good news is that we are only halfway done. There are 2 more talks to go, but before we get there, we're going to take a brief 10-minute intermission. So stretch your legs, check your email, grab a snack, and we'll be back together at 6:04. At 6:04, we'll be back together to restart TheoEd Talks. Thank you. Friends, welcome back to the second half of our program tonight. Again, we are so excited to have you with us. What an amazing start to this program, and we have two incredible speakers still left to go. Before turning to them, I just want to take a second to acknowledge some of the folks who are tuning in with us tonight. I know we have a number of people, members from First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. Some of you have been with us for all 6 TheoEd events, which is incredible. We're so grateful for your support and interest in this program. We also want to welcome the many Candler staff and students who are joining us tonight. I so miss seeing you all in person, and I hope that we have the chance to do so again very soon. A special shout out to students in my Sabbath as Rest and Resistance class. Remember, your paper is due on March 7th. I also want to welcome others who are joining us from various other churches and schools in Atlanta, including St. Luke's Presbyterian, Impact Church, McAfee School of Theology, and also Spelman College. Wherever you are tuning in from tonight, we hope that the discussions that our speakers are starting here don't end at the conclusion of our program. We've always hoped that TheoEd Talks would spark conversations that spill out beyond this room and into your homes and your churches and your communities. And we have 2 particular ways that we want to help you continue the conversation that you hear tonight. The first is that we have designed discussion guides for each and every one of our TheoEd Talks, both past and present. These discussion guides consist of a set of easy-to-use reflection questions that will help you make connections between these talks and your own life and faith. You can find these discussion guides on our TheoEd.com homepage under the Discuss tab. And what we hope is that you might use these talks along with their discussion guides as a type of curriculum for your Sunday school classes, your small groups, or your book clubs. The second way we want to help you continue the conversation is through what we are calling talk parties. Talk parties are an online forum through Zoom where you can gather with other people who have listened to these talks tonight to process and reflect and respond to the ideas that you are hearing. In the days following this event, we are going to host 5 talk parties, one of which will deal with the event as a whole, and then the other 4, one each for the specific talks that we have tonight. There's nothing you need to do to prepare. There's no cost. To find out more information about when these talk parties are occurring and how to sign up, simply visit our website, TheoEd.com, where you'll be able to find more information. We really hope you might join us for these opportunities to process and reflect on the talks that you are hearing this evening. Now, without further ado, let's begin again. Our third speaker tonight is the founding CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, a cultural institution here in Atlanta that's designed to connect the U.S. civil rights movement to contemporary efforts for peace and justice. He is also the former president and CEO of the Woodruff Art Center, and today he works towards advocating for racial justice in the arts. He has an undergraduate degree from Emory University, and he has advanced degrees from the Harvard Kennedy School as well as the Harvard Divinity School. His talk tonight is titled, "Is Reconciliation Right for America?" Please join me in welcoming Mr. Doug Shipman to the TheoEd stage.
I've been thinking a lot about my late friend, my late hero, the Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian. Reverend Vivian once told me himself about his work in Selma, Alabama. You see, Reverend Vivian was working for voting rights in Selma, and those were being held up by a man named Sheriff Jim Clark, who was a rabid racist, somebody who had brutalized the community for years. And every morning, Reverend Vivian would go to the courthouse steps. Some days Sheriff Clark would meet him at the door, some days he would ignore him, and some days he would beat Reverend Vivian. And every day, Reverend Vivian would ask for voters to be registered, and then he would pray for their reconciliation to one another as brothers. It also reminds me of other times that reconciliation happened around civil rights icons. Elwyn Wilson, who had beaten John Lewis in the head at a freedom ride, found him years later and apologized and asked for forgiveness. And John Lewis accepted it, and they were reconciled. Zenona Clayton spent years talking with Calvin Craig, the Ku Klux Klan leader of Georgia, until Calvin resigned as a Klansman and asked to be reconciled to Mrs. Clayton. These examples of reconciliation on the individual level are strong, but reconciliation isn't just an individual endeavor, it's an American one. You see, if we go all the way back to the beginning, if we go back to the founding of the country, there was a big revolution, the king was thrown off, the revolutionary warriors had won, but there was one problem. There were these loyalists still hanging around, neighbors, friends, family members who had fought for the king, who had fought for Britain, who wanted to stay in the colonies. What to do with them? And good old Alexander Hamilton, who we all know a lot more about because of the musical, defended the Loyalists. In court, in writings, he said that the Loyalists shouldn't be prosecuted or persecuted. They should be allowed back into the country for two main reasons. He said, in order to build this new country, we are too young and too unstable not to have them. And two, if we go persecuting them, it may lead to tyranny. It may lead to their rights being unprotected. And so Hamilton actually made sure that when the country was first built, reconciliation with the Loyalists occurred. Both the new country and those old enemies both moved forward together. And those Loyalists were reconciled over a 30 or 40-year period, scholars tell us, to the idea of the new country. Then, of course, there was another great war, the Civil War. And following the Civil War, the same question in a different form came forward. What should we do with the rebels, with the traitors, with those that tried to overthrow the Union? All of them, except for 14, were pardoned by President Andrew Johnson, and eventually those 14 were also fully pardoned. The idea was that with Reconstruction happening for those 12 years in the South, where the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were put in place by soldiers, that they would be reconciled back to the new vision of the country. But of course, as we know, it wasn't so. After those 12 years of Reconstruction passed, there was no reconciliation among many in the South to the new vision of the country. Jim Crow laws, segregation, lynchings, violence was perpetrated. They were not reconciled to that new vision. Unlike the Loyalists, those in the South still held on to the old vision of the country. Reconstruction failed, and reconciliation had failed. Then, of course, almost 100 years later, a second Reconstruction, as many scholars call the modern civil rights movement, occurred. An attempt to actually bring the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to life. The vision for a country that would be equal, a vision of a country that would include all Americans, especially Black Americans. That Reconstruction in many ways succeeded. Civil rights, voting rights, the falling of miscegenation marriage laws. In many ways, the country moved forward in a new vision. But as we can now see, as we stand over 50 years later, reconciliation, though in part happened with individuals, but did not, in fact, happen with the new vision of the country. We still have with us those that don't abide with the vision of a country that is free and fair for all. And so now, as we face calls, in many cases, for a third Reconstruction, the question becomes, what's the role of reconciliation on the individual level and on the societal level? And so I turn to Dr. King, and I turn to Dr. King's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. He wins the Peace Prize in '64. He gives a speech in early '65 in the midst of the American Civil Rights Movement. And he said, I accept this award with an abiding faith in America and on an audacious faith in mankind. An abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in mankind. Now, of course, many who have studied King know the famous quote that King said that the universe bends in the direction of justice. But the first part of that quote is the one to me that's more interesting. An abiding faith in America. An abiding faith in America that didn't want King. An abiding faith in America that was rejecting much of what he was working for. Why did he have an abiding faith in America in that moment? And to me, you have to go back a little over a year and a half to the I Have a Dream speech. Not the second half of the speech, the famous part of the speech that started with I have a dream, the one that most of us can quote. But my favorite part, the first half of the speech. The first half of the speech, standing on those steps in front of the Lincoln Memorial, King said that when the country was founded, that every citizen and every heir of that citizenship was given a promissory note. A promissory note inscribed in the Constitution, a promissory note inscribed in the Declaration of Independence, that every citizen, present and future, had a promise of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and all of the benefits of being an American. And that when black Americans had come to cash in the promissory note of citizenship, the government had marked it insufficient funds. And King said that he didn't believe that the American government was bankrupt enough not to pay that promissory note. He believed in America. He had an abiding faith in those original promises. And so in this moment, as we think about a reconstruction of our country, as we think about a reconciliation of our country, there are three things that come to my mind. Two of them individual and one of them collective. First lesson, individual reconciliation should be offered without transaction. C.T. Vivian, Sir Nona Clayton, John Lewis, Dr. King, they all offered reconciliation if someone was willing to respond in kind. They were willing to offer it without transaction. They were willing to offer it without promise. They were practicing what Dr. King had called in that Nobel Peace Prize speech, an audacious belief in mankind, an act of faith in their fellow individuals. I believe that in this moment we should be offering that. It is hard. Many of us have been downtrodden. Many of us have faced inequities. Many of us have faced violence. But that act is a moral one, and it's a one of individual faith, a faith in the other person, a faith in humanity. The second, which is communal, is actually something that is not from America. One of the other great moments of the 20th century when it comes to reconciliation was the moment following World War II. And what was Germany going to do? The Nazis had been defeated, but the German government had to face up to its atrocities against so many people, its atrocities against the Jewish diaspora. And in that moment, there was a poll taken in Germany. And the poll asked three questions. Number one, how did folks who were not Jewish feel about Jewish individuals? Two, did they feel as if they had any individual responsibility for what had happened? And third, did they believe that the country had collective responsibility for what had happened? Shockingly, 1/3 of Germans admitted that they still were anti-Semitic in that moment after everything that had happened. Even more shockingly, 2/3 of Germans said they bore no individual responsibility for what had happened under Nazi Germany. But a majority of Germans believed that collectively they bore a responsibility to make things right, that they collectively as a country bore a responsibility to somehow pay for the sins that had been committed. This is a very important insight, I believe, in the moment that we are. In order for society to reconcile, we want to have everyone who has done something admit that they were wrong. We want them to repent on an individual basis. We want them to come forward, and we want them to tell of their own atrocities. but the society may not be in that place. But that does not have to hinder communal reconciliation. That majority of Germans who believed that the country and the society should reconcile allowed the German government to pay reparations to Israel, to pay reparations to Jews who had been affected, to return artworks, to change their own constitution. It allowed them the tools and the support of the majority to do all of the things they needed to do in order to reconcile and come back into the international community, and also to do all that they could to reconcile for the atrocities they had committed. I believe that that lesson for America is so vital, because we know that reconstruction or construction doesn't work without reconciliation. And that offers us a way for reconciliation without having every single person having to admit that they, in fact, are responsible, at least not at first. But finally, there is that great reconciliation that we all want, the spiritual reconciliation, the kind of reconciliation that we saw that John Lewis received from Elwyn Wilson and that Zernona Clayton received from Calvin Craig, that reconciliation of someone who has done wrong, understanding that they have done wrong. And that reconciliation, I think, comes from a very interesting place. If you go through Scripture, Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible, and you look at the frequency of words, God is used several thousand times. Moses shows up about 1,000 times. But more than the word love, more than the word sin, more than the word repent, more than the word judge, is the word righteous. Righteous, depending on the translation, shows up somewhere between 550 and 650 times, more than any other call for a human behavior. Righteous. And it got me to thinking, why is righteous and righteousness showing up so much? And it's because being righteous is the way in which we get closest to the divine. Being right, being fully in the Spirit. But righteousness has an antithesis, self-righteousness. Selfishness. You see, righteousness, if you take it in the context in which it's given in Scripture, is often talking about community. It's talking about giving to others. It's talking about being generous. It's talking about denying the self. It's talking about love thy neighbor. It's talking about all the ways in which we support one another. That is when we find righteousness. Self-righteousness is when we find the opposite. We concentrate on ourselves. And so this notion of reconciliation is the practice of righteousness. It is the practice of centering someone else above ourselves. And in this moment, denying self-righteousness and embodying righteousness that is exemplified through our care for others feels like where we need to go. It feels like the moment that we need to embrace. It feels like that act of faith, that audacious belief in the future of mankind that Dr. King talked about. And so in this moment, I believe that reconciliation is not only right for America, but I think that reconciliation is required. It's required in order to achieve a new country, a new vision of the way that we live. It is a spiritual call for us to embody faith. It is the way in which we find ourselves closer to the divine. And it reminds me of something else that C.T. Vivian once told me. You see, when he told me about Jim Clark and he told me about his prayers, of course, I had to ask. I said, Reverend Vivian, why did you do it? Why did you pray for this man who clearly hated you? Why did you continue to come forward and every day ask that you two be reconciled as brothers? Why would you do that? And he said, because I wasn't just working for my own liberation. I wasn't just working for liberation for folks who looked like me. I wasn't just working for liberation of the people who lived in Selma. He said, I was working for the liberation of white folks. I was working for the liberation of Jim Clark. I was working for the liberation of people who hadn't even been born, because Jim Crow and segregation and racism were chains that enslaved us all. And I, C.T. Vivian, was working to try to help no one have to live under that system. The notion of reconciliation isn't just an expression of forgiveness. It's not just an expression of what has happened in the past. But as Reverend Vivian reminded us, it is an act of faith to try to liberate us all from a system that does not allow us to be fully human. I hope today that we will all take those lessons of C.T. Vivian and apply them on the individual basis and on a communal basis in our country.
Wow, what another incredible and timely talk for us to consider, the place of reconciliation and being in right relationship with one another in such a fractured time. Doug Shipman, thank you again so much for that talk. This brings us to our fourth and final speaker of the evening. She is a clinical psychologist, a public theologian, and a professor of practical theology at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology. Through her work, she advocates for justice both in and beyond the church, especially for women of color. She is the author of numerous books, including Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength. Like Doug Shipman, she has her undergraduate degree from Emory University, and she holds advanced degrees from Duke Divinity School and the University of Miami. Her talk tonight is titled Pathological Whiteness, Diagnosing the Hidden Wound. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes.
How does it feel to be a problem? This was the question that W.E.B. Du Bois posed to Black Americans in 1903 in his now classic text, The Souls of Black Folk. It had been just a few decades since the end of slavery and Reconstruction, and the United States was grappling with the problem of what to do with Black Americans who had been freed from slavery, but whose liberation threatened the unity of white Americans in the North and the South. Since then, the question of what to do about Black people has dominated discourse in the U.S. What do we do about Black people? About their poverty, their educational achievement gaps, their heightened rates of morbidity and mortality, their voting rights, even their presence in our neighborhoods, schools, and churches. The irony of this question is that it is whiteness and not Blackness that is at the heart of racism. There are many forms of racism around the world, but in the United States, racism is about promoting and maintaining white supremacy. The belief that white people are inherently superior to all other peoples of the world. And this includes everything about white people: their bodies, their aesthetics, their beliefs, customs, values. White supremacy maintains that white people are uniquely suited for citizenship and self-governance, that they ought to wield dominion and authority over all of creation, and that this is the way that God intends it. The cleverness of white supremacy is that it convinces us that it is the victims of racism who are the problem, when really the problem lies in the hearts, minds, bodies, and souls of the oppressors. Indeed, if anything has become clear since the election of November 2016, it is that America has a problem and its name is whiteness. So, white people, how does it feel to be a problem? Now, you might be uncomfortable by my explicit naming of whiteness and my use of terms like white people. It might feel like an insult or an accusation, but that itself is part of the problem. Why is it, after all, that we can use terms like Black and Latinx and Indigenous and Asian American, but when we say white, people cringe? Why is it that I am comfortable checking off the black box on survey forms, but white people don't like to have their race named out loud? Why is it that I can have a racial identity and white people cannot? That my race is marked, but whiteness is considered normal, neutral, just American? So again, I'll ask, how does it feel to be a problem? I have been navigating white culture for much of my life. And one of the things that I have noticed, indeed anyone can who's been in white spaces, is that white people often react in very culturally prescribed ways, especially when the topic of racism comes up. If you've been in these spaces long enough, you can begin to predict these responses with startling accuracy. Robin DiAngelo called one set of these responses white fragility. It's as if there is an invisible force field connecting white people across space and time, directing their responses in ways that they cannot see. In family therapy, we call that a system. And as a Black person who's been in that system, who's been living and working and sometimes worshiping in white contexts, I have had to learn how to navigate it in some peculiar ways many people of color do. We often have to code switch to adapt our behavior to fit into white spaces so that white people will think that we fit in, so that they'll invite us to the study groups or let us know about the jobs or write us letters of recommendation or hire us. We've had to learn the contours of whiteness in order to avoid its sharp edges. We have had to bend and sidestep and sometimes leap to avoid its assault. We have had to armor up, to harden and conceal ourselves to withstand the brunt of its day-to-day impact. This is the system that we have to learn to navigate. And it's not just a system, it's a pathological one. In other words, it is a dysfunctional pattern of behavior that white people often feel compelled to act out, even though it might pose a danger to people of other races, even though it might cause them distress. Now, as a clinical psychologist, I have a peculiar relationship to pathology. Other people like to turn away from pathology, to pretend it doesn't exist, to repress it, except for when they watch it on reality television. But clinical psychologists, we like to walk right up to pathology and say, "You mind if I take a closer look?" And so I have taken a closer look at the pathology of whiteness in order to identify its symptoms, because every pathology has its symptoms. And these symptoms are kind of the rules of white culture. I'm going to name a few of them today, and I'll say these are not definitive or exhausted, but do me a favor and try them on. See if they are descriptive of your experience of whiteness, whether that is your racial identity or not. The first symptom is conformity. Whiteness is kind of like the old American Express slogan, membership has its privileges. From the colonial period until today, whiteness has been a key marker of fitness for U.S. citizenship. In slavery, your racial identity was the sole determinant of your rights. If you were white, you were free. If you were Black, you were enslavable, and if you were indigenous, you were exterminable. The peculiar cruelty of U.S. slavery is that it only took one drop of African blood to make somebody, their default status was bondage. It took freeze papers to prove otherwise. In much the same way that brown people today might have to carry their identity papers on them to prove their documentation or their legal status. New European immigrants to the United States, this was the racial contract that they had to take part in. They had to prove themselves on the right side or the white side of this racial contract daily by adhering to white cultural norms. On the one hand, this meant giving up their own racial ethnic identity, their names, their language, their ways of eating and dressing, their holidays, their customs and traditions, and they had to take on the hallmarks of white middle-class propriety, avoiding conflict, valuing emotional restraint, privileging formal education over life experience, and having a perceived right to entitlement or comfort. In exchange for their conformity, they got to partake in the privileges and benefits of whiteness: freedom, land ownership, having the right to the access to the wages of their labor and the wages of other people's labor, being able to vote and have their vote counted fairly, even the right to be armed and angry in public space. But these were tenuous privileges. People striving for whiteness had to be constantly vigilant of how they were perceived by other people to make sure they were seen as being on the right side of the racial contract, because the system punished people who fell on the wrong side. It branded them as race traitors or maybe poor white trash. And so white people learned how to police themselves and how to police other people, because this is how you keep a system like slavery in place. You teach people to stay in their place, to conform. This brings us to the second symptom: trust in authority. Being able to conform to the system was dependent on being able to trust that the system would work in your behalf. And that's what the U.S. systems, the economic, judicial, legislative, even religious systems were designed to do, to promote and maintain white dominance in all areas of society. The Capitol insurrectionists knew this. This was the world that they saw weakening and that they wanted to reinscribe. They felt so assured of their right to do so that they took photos and videos of themselves breaking the law and posted it on social media. See, they didn't think it would matter because they thought the system would do what it would always done: have their back. And it's not just the insurrectionists who think like this. People conditioned into whiteness have been taught that those who wield authority and power will use it in their best interest, and that those authority figures will be held accountable if they do not. This is one of the reasons that so many white people, no matter if they consider themselves moderate or sometimes even liberal, they have difficulty condemning acts of police brutality against unarmed black people. Whenever a new video arises, you'll hear things like, well, we don't know what really happened before the camera came on. I mean, surely he must have done something to cause the officer to act that way. Or maybe you'll hear something more like, I know the officer was wrong, but people are too quick to protest. They just need to let the system run its course. You see, believing in the system, trusting in the authority of the system, means believing in the myth of meritocracy, the idea that people get what they deserve and earn. So if bad things happen to people, like poverty or slavery or getting killed by police, it must be because they've done something bad to deserve it, or because they failed to do something good to avoid it. This is how you think when you've been taught to trust in the system. The final symptom is selective sight. Living in a slave-holding society required white people, particularly white Christians, to live in a state of profound cognitive, emotional, and spiritual dissonance. Slavery was a brutal system. It required acts of daily terror and violence to keep it in place. Most white people, with the exception of abolitionists, were complicit in this system in some way. They either actively participated in it, or they looked the other way and pretended it didn't exist even as they reaped its benefits. Selective sight was what allowed them to deny and repress awareness of the evil that they were surrounded by and in which they participated. It allowed them to think of themselves and their relatives, their neighbors, their racial, ethnic skinfolk as good, morally upright people, even as they participated in this act of brutal horror. Selective sight is also the reason why so many white Americans, Christian or otherwise, had such a hard time coping with what happened on January 6, 2021 with the Capitol insurrection. Over and over again on the news, on social media, in one-on-one conversations, we've heard people say it, this is not who we are. But for many black people and other people of color, especially those of us who paid attention, well, this is who we are. This is who we always been. We've wondered why anybody was surprised. After all, the signs were there in full view. There were the takeover of federal lands in Oregon and Nevada, the riots in Charlottesville, the Michigan insurrection and plot to kidnap the governor, even the mobs that had been popping up in places like New York City and DC. These were all dress rehearsals. But when January 6th happened, so many white Americans had trouble believing it. They were dumbfounded by it because they were practicing selective sight. And this is what selective sight does. It teaches people to ignore the obvious, especially when the obvious indicts them and their racial ethnic skinfolk. So here we are. It's 100 years later since the publication of Du Bois's book, and the problem of the 21st century remains the problem of the color line. This time, though, it is clearer to us that it is not the problem of blackness, but it is the problem of whiteness, because it is becoming more and more obvious that whiteness is a dysfunctional system, that it is a pathology that poses a danger to the well-being of individual white people, definitely to the well-being of black and other people of color, and it poses a threat to the fabric of our democracy if left unchecked. And maybe, for those of us who call ourselves Christians, more than that, it poses a threat to the integrity of our witness as people who profess the same faith and claim to be part of the same body and claim to believe that we are all created in the image of God. The good news, though, is that culture can be changed and pathology can be healed. The first step is naming the disease and then identifying its symptoms. And I have given you 3 to begin working with today: conformity, trust in authority, and selective sight. The next step and your challenge is to begin to determine how each of these is evident in your own life and to begin to practice little acts of dissent against the pathology of whiteness. Because little acts of dissent can and do make a difference. So, in conclusion, I'll ask one more time. How does it feel to be a problem? And what are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Dr. Walker Barnes, thank you again for what is another powerful and timely talk. Friends, I hate to say it, but this brings our evening to a close. I want to once again thank our speakers for delivering 4 absolutely stunning talks. We are so grateful for you, the time you've put into this, and all the gifts that you have given us through your words and your thoughts and your passions. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in tonight. We are so glad to have you part of this TheoEd Talks series. I also want to thank a number of people who have helped make this event possible. I first want to thank the members of the Candler Foundry, Crystal Golden, Evie Arnold, Chloe Granberry, and Janine Warrington, who have worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make all of this possible. Thank you all so much for your work. I also want to thank Bob Ditzler, Tim Haney, and the rest of the production team who does an amazing job at producing and capturing this event. We are so grateful and really could not do this without you. I also want to thank the leadership of First Presbyterian Church and of Candler School of Theology for so generously supporting this initiative. And friends, if you've liked what you've heard tonight through this event, I encourage you to go to TheoEd.com. There you can find all of our talks as well as the discussion guides. You can sign up for our podcast. You can sign up to take part in our talk parties. We would love to have you continue the conversation beyond tonight in whatever way that looks like. Please stay tuned to our website, our Facebook page, our Instagram account for more information about the next TheoEd Talk event. And please share the news too. The link for this event, if you want to watch a replay or share it with a friend, will be available on YouTube, on our Facebook page, and on our TheoEd.com website. And soon enough, we'll have the individual talks and the discussion guides available as well. So friends, again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Be well, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. So long.